Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Romanticism in artwork. So one of the things that we did in the previous lesson was looking at Romanticism in literature and realism in literature, and then looking at capitalism and socialism in sort of the that's not literature per se, but it's in textbooks and in text writing. Today we're going to be looking at how does Romanticism express itself in artwork, particularly looking at Romanticism and Realism in artwork paintings. And more so than I discussed in the previous lecture, I'm going to be focusing on how does this also, particularly for Romanticism, illustrate itself in a nationalist tendency. And we're going to be looking at that in terms of a couple of paintings. Along with that, you also have realism, and I hope you remember that Romanticism and realism are opposite viewpoints, right? They are contrasting viewpoints. And we're going to look at pieces of artwork that are not, not 100% opposite of Romanticism, but they are really focusing on the work of average people, lower class folks. So we're going to be paying attention to those today. And then your assignment for today will be also looking at that. So let's turn our attention to Romanticism versus realism. So today, as I say, we're going to be looking at Romanticism and realism in artwork and seeing how does artwork respond to the Industrial Revolution and the changes that are occurring societally at this point. So we're going to be looking at four artists who represent four artists in each of the two categories, Romanticism and realism. So I want to just look at a couple of things first, right? I want you to notice that if you just look at the names, right? John Constable, William Blake, and Turner are all English. Goya is Spanish, and Delacroix is French. Same would be true for realism, again, a little bit later on. Courbet is French, along with Millet. I guess it's Millet. And then you have Brown is English and Trollope is French. So let's look first at Romanticism. We know already that Romanticism emerges in the 18th century as a direct response to the to the Industrial Revolution. And when we look at the ideas of the Industrial Revolution, we know that nature is being destroyed. We know that factories are coming into the world. And we also know that you have obviously railroads going through communities and going through forests and destroying nature. So people are very much aware of the destruction of the natural world. Romanticism, or at least one of the themes of Romanticism, is that nature plays an integral role in this. And Romanticism heightens, or at least puts some focus on nature. And you're going to see that, I think, in a lot of the paintings that we're going to look at today. Another piece to it, though, is the idea, is particularly in literature, but also in art, is how to try and inspire emotion. It's important for people to see Romanticism and romantic artwork as one that is supposed to fill a person with specific emotions. So this is expressed across the board in Romanticism, romantic writing of artwork, or feelings of feelings of sort of both pride, and particularly when it comes to nationalism. And we're going to look at one painting in particular that is supposed to show that. Romanticism is supposed to highlight this sort of feeling of the heart versus the rationality of reason. And one of the things I discussed in a previous video is the idea of how it's anti-enlightenment. So enlightenment is supposed to be this sort of heady, real, rational approach, calculated approach, whereas Romanticism is supposed to be more emotionally based. And you'll see that. So when we look at Romanticism, Romanticism is sort of a larger umbrella term as sort of a heading, and then below that you have, how it looks in different places, right? So for Britain, Romantic poetry, right, William Blake from the other day, looked at how do we try and get some sentimentalism to try and get us to take over the existing system, right? Give me my chariot of fire, my arrows of desire, right? Dark satanic mills, right? There's this sort of push towards that. For France, it's less about that. It's really more of the glory of man and the glory, and in a lot of ways, it's a passion towards nationalism. And again, you'll see that here. For Germany, nationalism obviously plays a role here too. Germany pretty much is abundant in nationalism in the 19th century. Spain is much more about reactions to the Napoleonic War. So in a lot of ways, obviously, nationalist as well. So when we look at the different names here, right, these names, some of them, we looked at these before, but you have Emily Bronte, who's English, Hugo, who's French, right, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Wordsworth, is English, and all these. So let's look at some paintings. So one of the things you'll see right here is nature, right? So this is John Constable, who is painting the Salisbury Cathedral of the Meadows. And you can see, right, obviously nature, a lot of green. There's a rainbow over the top, right? Religion often plays a large part in Romantic painting, largely because religion, I think, also has this sort of sentimental, emotional attachment for a lot of folks. You have no signs of the Industrial Revolution going on here. This is 1831, right? So you have, again, there's a river, stream, whatever it is. Again, a lot of Romanticism. This is probably one of the most famous Romantic pieces of artwork. So Liberty Leading the People. This is done by Delacroix in 1830. I hope you remember, even though we only very briefly talked about nationalism in France in the 1830s, that France goes through a revolution in 1830. You have the overthrow of Charles X, who is a sort of useless king, right? He was a Bourbon. He's, I guess, sort of the last of the Bourbons in many ways. Actually, well, not really, but anyway, he comes to power, and he's a very ineffective leader. And there's a revolution in 1830. And this painting obviously is supposed to be hugely nationalist, right? You have almost a Statue of Liberty-esque figure, right? This woman wearing a flowing gown, holding a gun, right? Again, symbol of the revolution, but she's holding the French flag, right? She's charging, leading the people over these bodies, right? Common folk behind her. Again, is this supposed to get you nationalist feelings, sentimentality? Young boys are included, right? Guy carrying two guns. Now in Spain, this painting is really much more about a feeling of nationalism, right? So you have a Napoleonic group of troops firing upon a Spanish liberator, Spanish fighter. He's sacrificing himself, right? Arms outstretched in almost a crucifix style, right? Again, this sacrifice of the person. Again, largely nationalistic, but again, these are French troops. It's anti-Napoleonic. This painting is really, really interesting because this one is specifically anti-industrial. You have this haze, you have this railroad coming straight at you but the haze behind it, as if almost where the railroad has been has disappeared, and the only thing, and you're sort of standing in the way. Again, anti-imperial, anti-industrial, um, anti-modernization. Realism, in a lot of ways, obviously, is exactly the opposite of that. Realism is really not supposed to be a critique necessarily, or not supposed to make you feel emotional, but rather it's supposed to be life as it is. It's not supposed to be focusing on those things. It's supposed to look at the impact of industrialization. It's anti-neoclassical. So neoclassical, I hope you remember, sort of Renaissance style, big columns, sort of ideal forms of humanity. Naked people, showing off their bodies. Right. This is really much more focusing on the working class. This is supposed to show really no natural world, right? You're not going to have much green in realist artistic expressions. You're not going to have much glory in there. It's really much more, again, the purpose of it is to show how people are living. And this is at the end of the 19th century, right? So we're talking about a period from about 1850 to about 1880 is probably the highlight of it. But then it also spreads on into the 1900s as well. So let's look then at a couple of images here, right? So this is one of the most famous images, right? The stone breakers. You have, again, not much green here. The point is not really to show the natural world. Rather, it's really just to show how people are really living, right? The sort of struggles, the struggles that people are having in their daily lives, right? This is a tough job. This guy's got a hammer. He's chomping away at some rocks. Look at this kid sort of bending under the weights of his rocks. Again, the purpose of it is to show really how difficult their work is. Now, this is an interesting one, right, from Malay, because you're showing agricultural workers. Again, back-breaking work. Look at them bent over, showing again the struggle that these average folks are experiencing. This is a English piece. It's a little tough to see, but again, you have a little bit of green, I suppose, but it's sort of just a mass of people. Again, so it's not focusing on the individual. It's very tough to see sort of who these people are. We don't necessarily care about what their faces are. A lot of them are turned away. Unlike, let's say, in a romantic piece, right, where you're supposed to see this lady's face and you're supposed to see the faces of these folks. Here, it's a lot less about the individual, but it's more about what's going on. And you have this sort of horde of massed people working and working and working. And then what do you got over here? Guys who sort of look like capitalists or industrialists standing off to the side, sort of in the shadows. Who's really the focus here? The middle class or the underclasses. Finally, another piece of this is sort of sketches of industrial work, right? Young men who are doing work in a factory, right? A dark factory. Again, this is just a coal painting, a sketch with coal. But again, it's supposed to show sort of the facelessness. And you're not really supposed to be focusing on who these people are, but rather the work they're doing. And then you have these sort of industrial figures, the capitalist figures, standing off in the background. When we looked at literature, right, I mentioned that we had Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. You have William Blake focusing on sort of the greatness of the greatness of England. Walter Scott, a Scottish author who writes about sort of the medieval period. For Dickens, right, you have obviously Oliver Twist and the stories we discussed the other day. So when we put all this together, the activity you're going to be doing tonight, or for homework today, is to pick one of the paintings that are discussed in the slideshow and discuss why it's romantic and then why it's realist. So use what I've discussed in this video and discussed the other day to try and analyze why an image is romantic or realistic. Then I want you to compare and contrast the styles that you have here, right? So again, discuss in artwork, not necessarily in the writings, but what in artwork makes the two styles very different. All right, good luck, guys.